What's up, Theory Creeps? I'm the Theory Creep, and today we're going to be talking about two television shows. Netflix's Stranger Things and HBO's VEEP. Okay, so let's start with Stranger Things. First of all, I feel the need to mention that most people on YouTube who talk about Stranger Things, and there's a lot of them, are focused on the nostalgia of the show. The 80s fanfare, the kind of conservative reliving of the past. It's a big part of the show, so I don't fault anyone for talking about it, but I think there's more going on with this show than just a kind of obsessive reliving of the past. If we're going to talk about nostalgia, which we're not, I'm not interested in talking about nostalgia in this episode. If we are going to talk about it briefly, I don't think Stranger Things is really unique for having like a strong nostalgia for the 80s and 90s. Like if you look at like the Marvel comic universe, if you look at the rebirth of the Star Wars franchise, our culture is obsessively reliving the past. Like, you know, you've got Ghostbusters, Hellboy, you've got Child's Play, the remake of Chucky, there's Mad Max, the Terminator's getting a reboot. Like everything is getting rehashed. There's nothing original going on these days. So the fact that Stranger Things has this like nostalgic obsession with the 80s, it's not that original. You know, a lot of things in our culture right now are reliving the past. Now, there's one nostalgic icon in Stranger Things that stands out to me among all the others. You know, you've got a lot of 80s stuff, obviously. But then you've got Dungeons and Dragons, which obviously was around in the 80s, but it's not really consistent with the nostalgic kind of framework and landscape of Stranger Things. Dungeons and Dragons is high fantasy. It's Tolkien-esque. It's not really in line with the other kind of 80s tropes in Stranger Things. Stranger Things is obsessed with like sci-fi, synth, neon, corporatism, the 80s obsession with materialism and toys. Dungeons and Dragons is an imaginary game that children played with nothing but their voices, and if they were lucky, like a battle mat and some dice and miniatures, if you were lucky. Most of the time, Dungeons and Dragons really is outside of the corporate kind of consumeristic realm. You buy a few books, and you can play Dungeons and Dragons for years. Also, like again, the high fantasy seems out of line with what's going on in Stranger Things. Stranger Things is obsessed with the future. It's obsessed with technology. You've got super high-tech interdimensional gateways. You've got aliens. These things aren't really Dungeons and Dragons tropes. Dungeons and Dragons is more like elves, dwarves, dragons, vampires, fantasy stuff, not science fiction. So what's Dungeons and Dragons doing in a show that's so obsessed with sci-fi and technology and the future? Dungeons and Dragons seems to get lumped in with other 80s stuff by other critics, but again, it's not really an 80s thing. So if we think of it outside of the nostalgic framework of the show, if we think about Stranger Things as a show that is obsessed with the 80s and 80s nostalgia, and is also strangely interested in Dungeons and Dragons, then maybe we can find out what's actually going on with Dungeons and Dragons if we can separate it from all this other nostalgia stuff going on. So another big influence on Stranger Things that goes unsaid, kind of unlabeled by the show, is H.P. Lovecraft. The horror in Stranger Things, the monsters, the kind of universe, is extremely Lovecraftian, which is to say, it's extremely unknowable. It's a matter of scale. Lovecraft was obsessed with the horror of scale. So you've got these monsters, these godlike giant interdimensional beings that would kill a human the way that a human would kill an ant. Like, it's not like these monsters are hunting us down in Lovecraft. It's just that they exist, and by their very existence, by their very scale and monstrousness, they murder us incidentally. Often these monsters aren't even aware of our existence, and just as we become aware of theirs, we lose our minds in Lovecraft, like the Mountains of Madness is a good example of that. So like in Lovecraft, in Stranger Things, the monsters are profoundly unknowable ancient interdimensional beings that these like small town bumpkins really have no hope of understanding. So, this is where Dungeons and Dragons comes in. So Dungeons and Dragons is a map for the characters in Stranger Things. It doesn't directly refer to the monsters that they're dealing with, but it does kind of analogously represent them. The characters don't have a name for these monsters, so they use Dungeons and Dragons monsters' names. So the kids give the monsters a name, but it's not their name. They probably don't have names. They don't really seem to speak English or anything like that. So the truth is that these arbitrary names that the kids are applying to these horrible monsters, they're as good as any other, really. The show doesn't give the characters any kind of reference to understand these monsters. So the obviously insufficient kind of lexicon that Dungeons and Dragons provides them with is the best they're going to get. And the show seems aware of this. The show is intensely superficial. They have a superficial understanding of the monsters they're dealing with, and the characters are themselves extremely superficial. There's not a lot of depth to anyone in Stranger Things. The show is obsessed with these physical commodity icons from the 80s, but the characters themselves are also kind of 80s icon reimaginings. Like, for example, Jim Hopper is wearing this Hawaiian shirt for a lot of season 2, I think. And just in general, like, he is a Tom Selleck Magnum PI reboot. Like, he's not that deep a character. He's just a standard, gruff, down on his luck cop. Like just like how Winona Ryder isn't that like developed. She's just a concerned mom. Like, no one in this show is a fully flushed out person, just like how no one in the show has a fully flushed out understanding of the monsters that are terrorizing them. Another example of this is the Upside Down, as the kids call it. It's the other dimension. It's like an other world, like a nether world that's kind of layered on top of ours. It's a pretty typical science fiction kind of dark fantasy trope. So the kids discover it and they don't have a word for it. So as they're describing it to people, they analogize what's going on with a Monopoly board. So they pull out the board game and they're like, so this is the town, you know, you've got the boardwalk and you've got the rest of the town on the top of the board game. And then on the other side of the board game, on the upside down side, you've got the underworld, and everything corresponds to the real world. And anyway, we don't have to get into the metaphysics of the show, but suffice to say that the label the kids use for this other world is laughably simple, but it's also the label that everyone else in the show uses. The show doesn't give us a more scientific or authentic term for this other world that exists on top of our own. It's the Upside Down. That's what everyone calls it. So there is no depth in Stranger Things. Stranger Things is nothing but surface. But it's worth considering, despite the superficiality, that this hasn't stopped people from connecting with Stranger Things. The truth is, we don't need depth to fall in love with people. We just need surfaces, because that's all any of us are. It's all any of us have. The deepest, most experientially kind of connective relationship that we have with the other still operates on the level of appearance and surfaces. Any appearance of depth is just that. It's an appearance. So something that I found myself asking as I was watching Stranger Things was, is this a comedy? Like, it's not a serious show. It's a tongue-in-cheek, kind of fun, like, adventure show. Like, they can't help but crack jokes in very serious, very dark moments. And it's not alone in this. Just very briefly, I live under a rock, so I only watched the new DC Superman movies and Justice League movie like a few weeks ago, and I gotta say that I was impressed. Not because they're good films, they're not, they're laughably bad films, but I was really taken aback by their seriousness, because everything else these days, like Stranger Things isn't unique in this kind of tongue-in-cheekness, nothing is serious these days. Like, you've got Marvel movies, which are huge hugely successful. Like, everyone talks about how much better Marvel movies are than DC movies. They're both pretty schlocky, but at least DC movies are making an attempt to make a serious film. They're trying to elicit some drama. Marvel gave up on that. Their movies are just fucking like comedies with a little bit of action and $100 million worth of CGI. And that's kind of how Stranger Things reads as well. It's just very, very jokey, very unserious. It's very hard for movies these days to settle down and tell a story. They need to break the action of the story up really regularly with jokes. That's happening across the board in media. It really seems like it's impossible for anything to take itself seriously these days. It seems like seriousness might be dying or dead. So what do we think about that? Like, should we mourn the death of seriousness? Is this a problem for us? I mean, if we're going to mourn something, we should make sure that we actually had it to begin with, right? Have we ever had seriousness? Have we ever had actual depth of understanding? Or have we only ever had the kind of superficial appearance of seriousness and depth? We tend to assume that a serious, sober approach to things leads to a better understanding of them. But the truth is, and this brings us to VEEP, the next subject of analysis that we'll be working with, the truth is that humor and lack of seriousness, the kind of tongue-in-cheekness that we see in Stranger Things and the Marvel comic universe and countless other franchises that seem like they should be very serious movies, the truth is that their tongue-in-cheekness, their lack of seriousness, may actually improve their ability to understand the world and improve their ability to represent the world honestly. VEEP is a fantastic example of this. So VEEP is a show that represents the American executive branch of government with a level of realism and honesty that is honestly unseen anywhere else in any other representation of American government. It's really, really striking. It's a constant reminder that it's partisan politics, career-driven selfishness, and like factional tribalism that drives DC politics. There are no dramas that do so nearly as well as VEEP, and VEEP is a comedy. We can also see this in late-night comedy talk show hosts like Jon Stewart, or Stephen Colbert, or Trevor Noah, or John Oliver. All of these guys are comedians, and the truth is they do a better job of reporting the news and giving an honest representation of what's going on in the political world of the US than most news channels do. The world is a funny place, and humor is an important tool for transmitting information about the world. So let's compare VEEP to The West Wing, which is a ridiculous show about Jed Bartlett, who's played by Martin Sheen. He's the president of the United States, and he's like a platonic philosopher king. It's ridiculous. Like, let me read his litany of accolades here. He's a chess master. He's a certified genius. He scored 1590 on the SATs. He holds a doctorate in economics, and he's a Nobel laureate in economics. Like, who is this man? When has the U.S. had a president anywhere near as qualified as Jed Bartlett? He's a fantasy. The show is supposed to be like a kind of realistic representation of the political dramas that presidents deal with, but like, it's just not. So Bartlett and his staff deal with political problems the way that a surgeon and his team deal with medical issues in a medical drama. Like, they're professionals, and the pleasure we derive from watching The West Wing is from watching professionals operate and seeing the professionalism and skill of these political operators. But the truth is, that's not how politics operates. The lowest common denominator is the one who decides who's in power, and often the people who end up in power are idiots. And most of the stuff they do revolves around idiotically trying to protect their careers and trying to clean up messes that they create from being so stupid. Politicians are incompetent. They're not, let's not get into my opinions on politics. Jed Bartlett is a fantasy, and the characters in VEEP, while they are comedy characters and they're not supposed to be realistic necessarily, are actually much closer to the reality of political activity in the US than the West Wing. The West Wing is so serious that it does itself harm. It actually misrepresents the world that it's attempting to represent because it's doing so with so much dignity and seriousness. The fact that VEEP cannot take itself seriously and show us how funny and terrible the world of federal politics is in the US means that it's much more free to show us the world as it is.
Politics is about people. I've met some people, okay, real people, and I got to tell you, a lot of them are idiots.
And the world that VEEP is representing is actually quite terrifying, right? The politicians in the world that we live in and in the world of VEEP, are really more concerned with personal relationships and kind of petty vendettas. They're concerned with their careers and their future campaign donations. They claim to be representing people, but really they're representing their own interests or the interests of their contributors.
Which way are you going to vote?
The way my principles and conscience tell me to go. Which way do you think that should be?
So if VEEP were to represent this terrifying world without a little bit of humor, it'd be a pretty dark show. It might be an unwatchable show. It might need humor to keep its audience engaged, and that might be the problem with the West Wing. The West Wing isn't using humor, it's using seriousness, which means that it can't be as scary as the world actually is.
You're here to spy, Jonah?
I'm not here to spy. I work at the White House, so I can just walk in and say, I'm from the White House. What are you doing?
Did the president call? No.
Because without humor to soften that blow, it would be, again, almost unwatchable. We shouldn't mistake VEEP and the West Wing for like polar opposites. VEEP is not 100% a comedy. It is a serious show. It's representing serious subject matter pretty honestly. The truth is that VEEP occupies a place between seriousness and humor. VEEP is in a third space, wherein it's free to tell serious jokes. It's free to joke seriously about serious matters. It's free to talk about serious matters in a joking way. So I've been using the term third space a lot in this series, and it's kind of a misnomer, right? Like it implies that you've got one zone and then another zone, and then a discrete third zone where those two zones can contaminate and mix. But the truth is that the fact that there is this third zone between these two seeming opposites like seriousness and humor, it kind of undermines the possibility of that dyad at all, right? Once there's a third space, that's kind of the only space that exists anymore. Because once you start to see humor in seriousness and seriousness in humor, even if you remove the third space and you're left with just this pair again, you've seen how they interrelate. You've seen how they connect to each other, and the possibility of distinguishing them becomes less and less sustainable. So keeping this third space in mind, let's go back to the nostalgia that I said I wasn't going to talk about that's present in Stranger Things and in pop culture at large. Critics of nostalgia, critics of reboots and repetition tend to lament a lack of originality in modern culture. They say, why can't we come up with any new ideas? But this is another dyad, right? The new and the repetitive, the original and the representation. And it's a dyad that we should do the same thing that we did with seriousness and humor with. We should find a third space between it, between originality and repetition. There's this mixing space, this third space that shows us that repetition is original and that any kind of originality has some repetitive elements in it. Nothing's really new. We're always borrowing from someone before us. And when we do that borrowing, when we repeat another person, we change what it is we're repeating. Nothing's a true copy. Everything carries a little bit of its unique context with it. There is no progress without stasis. There's no forward movement without a backward movement. This is a fundamental nature of culture that it repeats itself. And if everything is repetition, then there are no origins. There is no original. Everything is just an echo. And one name for these echoes is the virtual. But that's a subject for another video. That's it for VEEP and Stranger Things. Hope you guys enjoyed what I had to say. I'm the Theory Creep. This has been the Theory Creep. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.